He imagined his father's having suddenly been presented with both the Vladimir and the Andrei today, and in consequence being much better tempered at his lesson, and dreamed how, when he was grown up, he would himself receive all the orders, and what they might invent higher than the Andrei. Directly any higher order were invented, he would win it. They would make a higher one still, and he would immediately win that too. The time passed in such meditations, and when the teacher came, the lesson about the adverbs of place and time and manner of action was not ready, and the teacher was not only displeased, but hurt. This touched Seryosha. He felt he was not to blame for not having learned the lesson, however much he tried, he was utterly unable to do that. As long as the teacher was explaining to him, he believed him and seemed to comprehend, but as soon as he was left alone, he was positively unable to recollect and to understand that the short and familiar word suddenly is an adverb of manner of action. Still he was sorry that he had disappointed the teacher. He chose a moment when the teacher was looking in silence at the book. "Mikhail Ivanitch, when is your birthday?" he asked all of a sudden. "You'd much better be thinking about your work. Birthdays are of no importance to a rational being." "It's a day like any other on which one has to do one's work." Seryosha looked intently at the teacher, at his scanty beard, at his spectacles, which had slipped down below the ridge on his nose, and fell into so deep a reverie that he heard nothing of what the teacher was explaining to him. He knew that the teacher did not think what he said, he felt it from the tone in which it was said. But why have they all agreed to speak just in the same manner, always the dreariest and most useless stuff? Why does he keep me off? Why doesn't he love me? He asked himself mournfully, and could not think of an answer. Chapter 27. After the lesson with the grammar teacher came his father's lesson. While waiting for his father, Seryosha sat at the table playing with a penknife, and fell to dreaming. Among Seryosha's favorite occupations was searching for his mother during his walks. He did not believe in death generally, and in her death in particular, in spite of what Lydia Ivanovna had told him and his father had confirmed, and it was just because of that, and after he had been told she was dead, that he had begun looking for her when out for a walk. Every woman of full, graceful figure with dark hair was his mother. At the sight of such a woman, such a feeling of tenderness was stirred within him that his breath failed him, and tears came into his eyes. And he was on the tiptoe of expectation that she would come up to him, would lift her veil. All her face would be visible, she would smile, she would hug him, he would sniff her fragrance, feel the softness of her arms, and cry with happiness, just as he had one evening lain on her lap while she tickled him, and he laughed and bit her white, ring-covered fingers. Later, when he accidentally learned from his old nurse that his mother was not dead, and his father and Lydia Ivanovna had explained to him that she was dead to him because she was wicked, which he could not possibly believe, because he loved her, he went on seeking her and expecting her in the same way. That day in the public gardens there had been a lady in a lilac veil, whom he had watched with a throbbing heart, believing it to be she as she came towards them along the path. The lady had not come up to them, but had disappeared somewhere. That day, more intensely than ever, Seryosha felt a rush of love for her, and now, waiting for his father, he forgot everything, and cut all round the edge of the table with his penknife, staring straight before him with sparkling eyes and dreaming of her. "Here is your papa," said Vasily Lukitch, rousing him. Seryosha jumped up and went up to his father, and kissing his hand, looked at him intently, trying to discover signs of his joy at receiving the Alexander Nevsky. "Did you have a nice walk?" said Alexey Alexandrovich, sitting down in his easy chair, pulling the volume of the Old Testament to him and opening it. Although Alexey Alexandrovich had more than once told Seryosha that every Christian ought to know scripture history thoroughly, he often referred to the Bible himself during the lesson, and Seryosha observed this. "Yes, it was very nice indeed, Papa," said Seryosha, sitting sideways on his chair and rocking it, which was forbidden. "I saw Nadinka." Nadinka was a niece of Lydia Ivanovna's who was being brought up in her house. "She told me you'd been given a new star." "Are you glad, Papa?" "First of all, don't rock your chair, please," said Alexey Alexandrovich. "And secondly, it's not the reward that's precious, but the work itself." and I could have wished you understood that. If you now are going to work, to study in order to win a reward, then the work will seem hard to you. But when you work, Alexey Alexandrovich, as he spoke, thought of how he had been sustained by a sense of duty through the wearisome labor of the morning, consisting of signing 180 papers. Loving your work, you will find your reward in it. Seriosha's eyes, that had been shining with gaiety and tenderness, grew dull and dropped before his father's gaze. This was the same long familiar tone his father always took with him, and Seriosha had learned by now to fall in with it. His father always talked to him so Seriosha felt as though he were addressing some boy of his own imagination, one of those boys that exist in books, utterly unlike himself. And Seriosha always tried with his father to act being the storybook boy. You understand that, I hope? Said his father. Yes, Papa, answered Seriosha, acting the part of the imaginary boy. The lesson consisted of learning by heart several verses out of the Gospel and the repetition of the beginning of the Old Testament. The verses from the Gospel Seriosha knew fairly well, but at the moment when he was saying them he became so absorbed in watching the sharply protruding, bony knobbiness of his father's forehead, that he lost the thread, and he transposed the end of one verse in the beginning of another. So it was evident to Alexey Alexandrovich that he did not understand what he was saying, and that irritated him. He frowned, and began explaining what Seriosha had heard many times before and never could remember, because he understood it too well, just as that suddenly is an adverb of manner of action. Seriosha looked with scared eyes at his father, and could think of nothing but whether his father would make him repeat what he had said, as he sometimes did. And this thought so alarmed Seriosha that he now understood nothing. But his father did not make him repeat it, and passed on to the lesson out of the Old Testament. Seriosha recounted the events themselves well enough, but when he had to answer questions as to what certain events prefigured, he knew nothing, though he had already been punished over this lesson. The passage at which he was utterly unable to say anything, and began fidgeting and cutting the table and swinging his chair, was where he had to repeat the patriarchs before the flood. He did not know one of them, except Enoch, who had been taken up alive to heaven. Last time he had remembered their names, but now he had forgotten them utterly, chiefly because Enoch was the personage he liked best in the whole of the Old Testament, and Enoch's translation to heaven was connected in his mind with a whole long train of thought, in which he became absorbed now while he gazed with fascinated eyes at his father's watch chain and a half-unbuttoned button on his waistcoat. In death, of which they talked to him so often, Seryosha disbelieved entirely. He did not believe that those he loved could die, above all that he himself would die. That was to him something utterly inconceivable and impossible. But he had been told that all men die. He had asked people, indeed, whom he trusted, and they too, had confirmed it. His old nurse, too, said the same, though reluctantly. But Enoch had not died, and so it followed that everyone did not die.